How could the Toronto Police possibly have made this mistake?
At that time, to help with the missing persons investigation. Have a permanent address.
The last moments of 22-year-old Tess Ritchie before she was murdered and left in an alley.
When I was around 18 years old, I remember listening to the radio and hearing about a girl who went missing around the corner from my house. I lived in a smaller town back then, and everyone seemed to know who you were. High schools around the corner from one another, parties, dances. Word spread fast in St. Catharines, let me tell you. Weeks passed and the town was in some sort of daze until they found the body and the suspects were arrested. They were Paul Bernardo and Carlo Homolka. And to this day, I will never forget that. It was so close to home. After experiencing that, I had no idea what I was in for next. Let's see. I'm in my early 50s now. I'm not going to sit here and go into the typical cop speech about what I saw and went through. That's not why I'm here. But let me tell you, there are some things you just cannot unsee. Too many for me. When I was in my early 30s, I worked at the forensics unit at the Toronto Police. I lasted a mere 3 years. My time was up, and I had to leave. Staying would have ruined me, and it was probably the best thing that I ever did in my life. I remember working alongside a few detectives who were investigating the Holly Jones case. In case you don't remember, Holly Jones was a 10-year-old girl walking home from a friend's house. She was abducted by a scumbag called Michael Briere, and he was a software developer, a sexual predator. Through awesome investigative work, I have to say, and a few detectives who I know personally broke the case wide open, and my hat goes off to all of them. They were the real cops. I worked alongside them, and I was myself presented with an award for my efforts, and that was my biggest achievement. So throughout the years afterwards, I really got into the investigative side of policing after I retired, and after starting this channel, I began to think about these next 3 cases and how the Toronto Police Service failed the families of the victims through sloppy and lazy investigations. The purpose of this series is to unravel, dissect, and investigate the botched investigations rendered by the Toronto Police. In part 1 of this series, we are going to focus on the Shermans, Barry and Honey Sherman. I'm sure we have all heard about the Sherman murders back in 2017 in a quiet upscale neighborhood in North Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I won't go into detail about how Barry and Honey met or about how the Shermans gained their wealth, but focus more on the investigation by the Toronto Police. And perhaps a killer might have been found if not for the Toronto Police Service's inept investigations. Barry and Honey Sherman were Canadian royalty. Barry owning Apotex, a generic pharmaceutical company, and Honey, a philanthropist, a fixture in the Jewish community. The two had 4 children together: Lauren, Jonathan, Alexandra, and Kaylin. On the day of Wednesday, December 15th, 2017, the Shermans met one another at Barry's office at Apotex to discuss plans for a property they were having built in the Forest Hill neighborhood of Toronto. According to family members, everyone knew that on Thursdays, the Shermans would stay home, a kind of ritual they had. That evening, Honey left Barry's office and drove home, arriving before Barry in her Lexus SUV. Well, the rest is history.
We have sufficient evidence to describe this as a double homicide investigation, and that both Honey and Barry Sherman were in fact targeted.
On December 15th, 2017, the Sherman's real estate agent found their bodies. The Toronto police were contacted and attended 50 Old Colony Road, the Sherman's home. An investigation was commenced, and what followed was a cluster of incompetence, subpar investigations, and a lack of investigative skills needed to solve a homicide investigation of this magnitude. What should have been an open and shut case turned into an 8-year hell for the Sherman's family and children. As we delve into this 3-part series and the mishandling of these investigations, we will also show that the Toronto police seem incapable of conducting even the simplest homicide investigations. Now come take a drive with me, and I'll tell you a story that's hard to believe. This is Mad Lab Press. So let's start with the actual day of the murders. What we know is that the Shermans were found by their real estate agent. The next day, December 15th, both the Sherman bodies were located at the farthest rear part of the home. Now in this area is an indoor swimming pool, and it's kind of located in the basement. According to the family members, though, this area in this pool was not used by the Shermans. So while Toronto police are on the scene, they did a brief investigation and came to the conclusion that this was a murder-suicide scene. They believed that Barry Sherman killed his wife, Honey, and then killed himself. And the lead investigator for the homicide squad in the Toronto police was Detective Sergeant Brandon Price.
Looking for an outstanding suspect.
On the day the bodies were found, several people were in the house. There was a gardener, a personal trainer, a real estate agent, and a handyman. I have located a conversation between Kathleen Goldhar, she's a CBC writer, and a maintenance worker who was in the house that particular day.
So tell me about that day.
December 15th, I think it was.
And how would you describe her?
Interesting character.
What does that mean?
Well, she was demanding. I knew I had to have my ducks in order when I talked to her. So she'd call me out if she didn't think something was right. Usually she yells down the stairs to me, screams something at me, and then I just continue on my day.
But on this day, the house felt different.
As soon as I walked downstairs, it just something I'd been there for years and years, and she was always concerned about lights and doors and all that being kept closed, and lights and doors were wide open, and I just thought something was off.
So on this cold December morning, in this unusually quiet house, he continued downstairs to do his work in a room right beside the Sherman's indoor pool. A pool that had not been used in years.
No, nobody goes down there. That was kind of a room that they hadn't used, or I stopped servicing it years ago, and I would always go down there previously, but never anymore. From the basement, the garage, you can see the glass wall, and you can see if there's lights on in that room, and there was no lights. I think it goes further than just your everyday murder. I think it ties back to COVID.
What do you mean?
Because he's a manufacturer of the only treatment for COVID. He had a surplus.
What was that? What was it?
I think it's ivermectin, I think is my understanding.
Oh, I see.
So
you think that somebody had some sense ahead of time this was happening?
yeah, that's my.
Okay, so it just makes you nervous to know that you know that?
There's ties to the underground world. Somebody who's created this whole farce that we're living in right now. And my boss called me and says, did you hear? And I said, no, what? And he says, well, you were at the Shermans this morning, and apparently they were found inside the house deceased. I'm like, oh, Jesus. And then from there, kind of everything in my head started spinning, trying to think. Like I said, it just didn't feel right from the second I walked in the door. So it was like, wow, I was pretty surprised.
When did you finally hear from the police?
Like several weeks.
So let's take a step back to the crime scene itself. The Shermans were found in the indoor pool area. Both seated. Both had belts wrapped around their necks. And these belts were attached to the pool railings. Barry Sherman still had his glasses on and was seated with his legs crossed, whereas Honey Sherman also had a belt around her neck, was slumped over to one side. Whoever murdered the Shermans positioned their bodies this way. Both Barry and Honey had their jackets pulled down, halfway down their arms, restricting their movements. Now let me say that again. They both had their jackets pulled down around their arms. So technically they really couldn't move. Now according to the Toronto Police Homicide Unit, Barry strangled Honey and then somehow strangled himself to death. A murder-suicide. Now how does that make any sense at all? Detective Brandon Price, the lead investigator, advised that exact evening they were found that there were no outstanding suspects and was deemed a murder-suicide. Toronto Star's Kevin Donovan advised he had applied for several ITOs. Now, an ITO is called an information to obtain, and it's a document that Kevin Donovan was applying for to get information on the homicides from the Toronto Police, which he did. The ITOs suggest the deaths stunned family and friends for a number of reasons. The Shermans had been married for 40 years with no history of abuse or violence. Not only were they planning to build a new home together, they had planned trips to Japan and Israel. According to court documents, the housekeeper and trainer were first to arrive the morning of, at around 8:25 a.m. And they told police the couple's house alarm was off. They thought this was odd. It was the first time they had seen the alarm deactivated in the 3 years they had been working there. They hired noted criminal defense lawyer Brian Greenspan within 72 hours of the bodies being found. He assembled his own team to investigate and later set up a tip line offering a potential $10 million reward at that time. Now, since then, the reward has increased to $35 million. We will get into that a bit later. Now, Brian Greenspan ordered a second autopsy, which was performed, and it was deemed that both the Shermans had been strangled to death, and they were both murdered. Now, the Toronto Police waited 6 weeks to then turn around and say that the Shermans were murdered. It took them a whole 6 weeks. Why, you ask? Perhaps Brian Greenspan was a huge thorn in their side. So what we know now is that the lead investigator was Brandon Price. December 15, 2017, the TPS Homicide Unit deems the Sherman scene a murder-suicide. According to court documents, the Toronto Police only deemed this to be a double homicide 6 weeks after the murders happened, as we saw before. Now this is only because Kevin Donovan obtained the ITO court documents and the information was coming out regardless, so the Toronto Police had to come clean. The Toronto Police did not even start a canvass for video evidence until January 20th, 2018. That's 37 days after the murders. 37 days. The Toronto Police didn't even collect DNA from anyone until 9 months after the murders. Yep, you heard it right. 9 months. Brian Greenspan's forensic team also concluded that the Toronto Police never even vacuumed the scene for fibers and hair samples, potentially left by the suspects, which is common practice for any seasoned homicide detective. There was also jewelry found in the driveway that wasn't even Honey's, and it didn't belong to anybody in the house. Hank Insigna, who's a Toronto Police seasoned detective, begged that anyone who sent a tip in through the Crime Stoppers line should resubmit them again. Did they lose them in the first place?
I would encourage anyone who has provided tips in the past to the private investigative team to please resubmit those tips directly to the police.
Say you got 243 tips. The investigative team, private investigative team, got 243 tips. Now that that's ended, why do you need those people to resubmit those tips?
I believe it was 343 tips, and I want to be sure that we have all of the tips that were provided in the past. So I just want to encourage people, if you have submitted that information, please do resubmit it to us so that we can go through all of that information.
So they have 342 tips that the Sherman family's investigative team handed over to the homicide squad within the Toronto Police. And now, the head of the homicide squad is asking the public to resubmit those tips. What happened to those tips? Did they lose them? Did somebody delete them by accident? Or did somebody delete them on purpose? So Jonathan Sherman is suspect number 1. Jonathan was openly gay, and both the Shermans disapproved of his lifestyle. According to family and friends, Jonathan and Honey hated each other. Jonathan also owed Barry Sherman $60 million plus, which Barry had asked him to pay back just before the murders occurred. Then there were Barry's cousins, the Winters. Carrie Winter, who is close with Barry, also owed him $8 million, which Barry had lent him for his construction business. Now the two became estranged after finding out Barry had cut him out of a 20% stake in his business, Apotex. A 10-year-long battle ensued. Barry won, Carrie lost. Now Carrie owed Barry millions, and he was not happy about it.
He cared about one thing: money. Making lots of it, and not caring who he destroyed, who he stepped on, or who he fucked over, like me and my brothers.
I would talk about killing Barry, and it was very graphic. The way I was going to do it wouldn't have been belts. It was going to be in the Apotex parking lot. That was my vision, always, that he'd come out of the building in Apotex and I'd be hiding behind a car, and I just decapitate him. I wanted to roll his head down the parking lot, and I just sit there waiting for the police.
Then there were the big pharma companies. The other big pharma companies like Bayer had sent a fixer named Paul Wybrow, who was a former undercover fraud detective with London's famous Scotland Yard Police, who later worked as a private investigator for Bayer. Paul Wybrow was sent to spy on Barry and pretend he was there to pitch a charity to Barry, but was actually there to gather information about Apotex's trade secrets. According to Paul Wybrow, Bayer had also sent another fixer named Steve Smith. Steve Smith advised this to Paul before Barry was murdered.
Smith wanted us to try and find somebody to put something in Sherman's trunk of his car.
Smith also allegedly suggested planting drugs in Barry's car or setting him up in a sting operation with a minor. Allegations that were first reported in Fortune magazine in 1999. In the article, Smith was called Bayer's spy master.
He said he could arrange for someone in the Toronto police to stop him on his way home and search the car and find it in his trunk.
Now, to top it all off, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, had dinner with Barry Sherman days before the murder happened. Yes, Justin Trudeau. The same Justin Trudeau who met with the Toronto Police Chief Myron Demkew at the beginning of 2024. The details of that meeting were kept secret from the public. Justin Trudeau also was at the Sherman funeral. Now, what vested interest does the Prime Minister of Canada have with a big pharma owner like Barry Sherman? And why aren't the details of their meeting public? How does a criminal fixer who works for Bayer, one of the largest pharma companies in the world, have influence to have a Toronto police officer plant drugs in Barry Sherman's car?
Express to Toronto's top cop that you would like to see the laws respected and abided by?
My job is to make sure that all Canadians are safe and feel safe across the country, and that is the conversation we had.
In my years of being a cop, I was a stellar investigator. I was exceptional at what I did. I have solved many investigations throughout my career, and I'm going to take a stab at this one. So if the Sherman family is listening and wants a real investigator to investigate their parents' murder, then hire me, because the Toronto police are massively inept at solving crimes. This case will eventually be solved, but as each day passes, it chips away at those chances. The Toronto police failed miserably in this investigation. In my next two videos, we will delve into two other murders the Toronto police botched, and we'll try and figure out why this keeps happening. A few days ago, I went to the old Sherman house. I knew it had been torn down, but I wanted to see it in person. This was all that was left, an empty lot. So while I was flying my drone, and without warning, something took it over and violently crashed it into a tree where the Sherman house once was. I had lost all control over it. The entire drone was broken. Maybe someone was trying to tell me something. This is Mad Lab Press.